This is Rue Ziegler interviewing Virginia Sims on January 21st, 2009. And this interview is an oral history for the Jack L. Davies Agricultural Land Preservation Fund Oral History Series project on the creation of the Ag Preserve. May I call you Ginny?
Please do.
Ginny, I wondered if we could get your full name and your place and date of birth.
Okay. My full name is Virginia Ann Hemphill Sims. My date of birth is 10/24/27, and I was born in Hays, Kansas.
And how do you spell Hemphill for the transcriber?
Hemphill.
All right. Now, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your early years and your early schooling, and then we'll come to 1955, which I think is when you moved to California.
That's right. We moved here moved to Napa in 1955.
Napa in 1955. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your early years and your early interests in grade school.
Oh, well, when we lived in Hays in the very early 30s, actually late in the 20s, the Dust Bowl began in that part of Kansas. And so we lived there until 1935, probably very close to 1936 when we moved. My dad had a change in companies, and we moved to Kansas City, Missouri, stayed there for only 6 months, and then moved to St. Joe, Missouri, and where I spent the next 9 years. So my early life was spent in the small town in Kansas with a lot of family around. My mother's sister and her family, my grandparents lived on a farm outside of Waukene. And in later years, in those years when we were in Missouri, my brother and I would go out to the farm for extended periods of time, he to help with the harvest and later the planting, and I to do or assist with the house and the kitchen. I wasn't very good at that. I started really young, wasn't any good, probably more trouble. But, in the summers there, we did meet some neighborhood kids, and it brought home the problem of what the Dust Bowl was doing. Because when we would come back, there would always be one family or two families that had to abandon and had put everything in their car and headed west. So during those days, we thought California was the end of the earth. They never came back, and you never heard from them again. So you just thought maybe they fell off. As a child, you thought, well, what happened to them? So, and in St. Joe, I went to school all the way through the 9th grade in St. Joe. It had a very good school system, really. But it was a totally Jim Crow town. St. Joe was the farthest north southern city in the United States. It was culturally southern.
And Missouri had gone pro-slavery.
Yes, that was the old, the old border wars. And the source of the Dred Scott decision was in Missouri, on the other side of the St. Joe's on the western edge, and St. Louis, where the Dred Scott incidents occurred, were on the other side, on the Mississippi side. We were on the Missouri River. So I think that culturally was quite a shock, because I'd never seen a black, except in books, until I was 8. And then within a matter of months, I was in a community which was almost 20% black and yet was completely segregated. The back of the bus, the whole business.
What did your father do?
He was in insurance. He was in life insurance. He was a manager for Equitable Life from then until his death, really.
So, Ginny, you were saying that your father worked in insurance.
Yes, he was with Equitable Life from 1936 until his death in 1961.
Now, where did you go to middle school and high school?
Well, middle school was in St. Joe, and I was 15 when my dad was transferred out to California. The war had just begun. That would have been the spring of 1942. And so my brother stayed back at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. He stayed there to finish his academic year, but the rest of us all moved. And we came out to Oakland, which was where my dad's new position was.
So he was with a new insurance
No,
company?
it was a promotion within the Equitable.
Oh, I
Yeah.
see.
Yeah.
So you lived in Oakland?
We lived in Oakland, and went through high school at Oakland High. And then I went to Scripps College for women for a year, then came back to UC Berkeley for a year, and then went to Stanford and finished at Stanford, class of 49.
And what was your major in?
The last 2 years it was in political science. But that was also the only thing I could do to get in and out in 2 years. Having changed schools so many times, you got the units, but you didn't often get the class. You might not get every class credit.
Uh-huh.
In those days, it was kind of choosy.
Well, what was your particular area of interest when you were at Stanford?
Well, I really loved poli-sci. I had a music appreciation minor that I had worked at Berkeley and again kept that up at Stanford. In college, you're just sort of majoring in social life as well as school, and I just had a really good time at Stanford then.
So at this point, you hadn't particularly gotten interested in urbanization,
No,
or growth
no.
issues, or
No, I think I was interested in social issues, and I took quite a lot of comparative religion and philosophy when I was there, all the way through. But I would say I didn't really have a major interest. I considered law school, but that was a long stretch, and all the men were coming back from the war. And it was during a time when there was a great deal of social pressure for women not to take their place.
yes, because by the time you were at Stanford, this must have been 47?
It was 47 to 49. So the men started coming home during my freshman year in college.
Yes, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, when you finished Stanford, where did you?
Well, I finished Stanford and went to work for General Electric lamp company as a secretary, and wound up. It was a very good job for a young person, because my boss had been an admiral in the Navy, and he was the first person ever to get an appointment to the academy from having enrolled as a common sailor, having gone into the Navy as a common sailor. So he was full of things that you just could learn from right and left. And it was kind of fun because, in a way, my spelling, let's say, and my grammar was probably as good or better than his, but not my knowledge of anything I was doing.
Well,
It was great fun.
He was a very experienced person to be. He headed up his own company. Is that
Well,
right?
he
Then
headed
left-
up that division of General Electric.
Huh. I mean, he had a very different kind of experience, having come from the military.
Yeah, and he was a very interesting man.
He must have been very smart.
He was very smart. And he also had a very clear way of letting you know what he wanted, so that he wasn't gruff, he was just simply direct.
So you were exposed to good management
Yeah.
and leadership.
Really, he was, yeah. Yeah, he was and I didn't work there a whole long time because Warren and I got married, and then our first child came along really, within 10 months. So I didn't work with Mr. Foggy, Admiral Foggy, for very long. about
Now,
a
how do you
year.
spell Falge?
Falge.
And now the GE office was
Oakland.
in Oakland.
Mm-hmm.
And then when did you marry Warren? What year was
Of
that?
December of 1949.
And his name is Warren.
Warren Goodell Sims, all family names. The Warrens of the early Warren families. There's a Goodell
How do
family.
you spell Goodell?
Goodell.
Uh-huh.
So he was on his mother's side. It's easy to trace his bloodline back to the Mayflower. A couple of our grandkids have joined the Mayflower Society. That is, their mother joined it for them, just to keep that connection alive.
And now what was Warren doing?
Warren actually had been in the war, had come back, had finished his college at UC, and he went to work also for the Equitable for another manager in San Francisco.
So he graduated from UC Berkeley.
Yes.
And 10 months later, your first child was born?
Pretty close, yeah.
In Oakland?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And her name?
Well, actually, he was born in San Francisco. We were living in San Francisco by that time, and he was born at UC San Francisco, there on the hill.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And did you have a second child soon afterward? Or?
No, it was 3.5, almost 4 years before Wendy came along. Doug was first, and then Wendy. And that's all the children that we have.
Now, I understand that you belong to the American Association of University Women. Had you joined already at this point?
I joined when I came to Napa, which was in 55.
All right, and we're still, by the time Wendy was born.
She was about 1.5 years old when we moved here.
Oh, all right.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're coming to the time when you and Warren moved to Napa.
Yeah, we moved to Napa.
And why did you come?
Well, the Equitable had no agents up here working, and so they moved 2 men up here to start, to work for the life insurance business in Napa. And so we came because of that. And also, Warren's godmother and godfather lived in the hills over in Napa. They lived on the property now owned by Mont LaSalle.
Oh.
So Warren had been in and out of Napa County as a boy, all of his life. So he was very familiar with it.
So did you meet Warren through your father?
No, I met Warren through my brother's wife. At their wedding in 45, Warren had just come home from the service, and he knew my brother's wife. They had gone all the way through grammar school and together, and I guess up to 8th grade. I really don't remember how the schools ran in then. So she found out he was home a couple of days before the wedding and called and said, I hear you're home. Do come to the wedding. So.
And the rest was history.
Yeah.
So now you've moved to Napa.
In 55.
Where did you live in Napa?
We lived in Alta Heights, about a half a mile from where we are right now.
And Warren is, of course, working with Equitable.
He was, and then in about 1958, instead of selling life insurance, he went to work for their training division, so that he was training agents in the various sort of uses of life insurance, specialized uses, or running them through as early trainees, that kind of thing. And his territory was about the western third of the United States at first. And so he was gone more than he was home for a number of years there.
And then you have these 2 very young children.
Yeah.
Now, was this the point at which you joined the American University?
I probably joined AAUW within a very short time of coming to Napa. Warren's godmother was here still, and she got me to join community projects.
And what was her name?
Her name was, at that time, her name was Virginia Wallace, but she married Warren's father and later became another Virginia Sims. So we both had Virginia H. Sims, and she was very active in this community. She had begun the TB Society. She was a founder of community projects. She was on the board of the local hospital. She was very, very active.
And her name was Wallace?
Yes, she had married Ed Wallace, and they had lived here. Ed died in 49.
So she was a widow.
Mm-hmm.
And then she met Warren's father, who was a widower.
Yeah, well, no, he was divorced. They divorced. Right.
So she was older than you.
Yeah.
Of course. So she was kind of a mentor, would you say?
Well, certainly in terms of getting into the community, she knew just about everybody. Napa wasn't very big, in those days. And maybe it was 10,000. I'm not real sure. Probably not. And she had been here since the 30s, so she and Ed knew an awful lot of people. And she had been instrumental in getting my brother, who was an OB graduate, to come to Napa because they had lost the one doctor who did most of the babies. And so she knew that. She knew Art was coming out of his residency, and wanted to entice him to Napa, which she did.
Now, did you also belong to the Stanford Club at this
Stanford Club did not exist at that point, the local one. I belonged to the AUW, and then I belonged to community projects. It's a women's service organization that, as far as I'm concerned, is probably the best run business in all of Napa. Very, very fine. Run a thrift shop, put on an annual event, which they no longer do. They no longer put on what we called the fancy fair.
But they're
still very active. They have a thrift shop down on 3rd Street. But they were Bundles for Britain is how they started. And then when America got into the war, when the United States got into the war, then they continued their work with servicemen, but broadened it with the thrift shop to make money to do those things. And then they found they were making enough money that they began giving money within the community. So they're one of the big donor organizations. They built almost all the swimming pools. They built gymnasium bleachers. They would give quite a bit of money to things the school district couldn't afford. They gave money to the Boys and Girls Club when it began. I'm trying to remember, but every year they give away quite a bit of money.
So you were able, through your association with Warren's now stepmother, and community projects, and to get quite involved in what was going on in the community.
Yes, I was. They weren't particularly interested in what was going on, but the AUW group that I was in had a lot of people who were familiar with schools, and they were familiar with that end of the community.
And what was your first sort of awakening to the issues of urban growth?
Oh, gosh.
I read somewhere that Rachel Carson.
I read her book.
Had an influence.
Yeah, when I read her book, I recognized, of course, that was what could happen any place. And there's so much of that book whose setting is Lake County, the examination of trying to save something, and in doing so, making a huge mistake. And so that really interested me. And I guess the other thing was, politically, I became interested in the local government and how, there was a city and then there was a county, and so I hadn't paid any attention to that, to how California was organized.
And for the record, the Rachel Carson book was Silent Spring.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that came out in the early 60s?
I think so. I still have a battered up copy someplace, but yeah, I think so. And by 1958, there was a 30-person citizens committee selected to look at the preparation of college preparatory students in Napa's high school. There was one high school, and one of the board members knew me, and so he appointed me to that committee. And that committee broadened my interest in what was going on in the community. And by that time, I had to resign from community projects because I only had so much babysitting. And so I switched it into the Citizens Committee. In other words, when I had to be there, that was how I used my babysitting.
And now, so what were some of the projects that you remember with Citizens Committee?
Oh, well, we actually looked at the composition of classes. What were kids taking? What was the content of the class? We looked at performance in English, written English, and in all kinds of measures, and saw that the English intelligence of the kids was dropping, small but very consistently lower each year. We didn't have a non-mathematical life science. We didn't have any science in high school that didn't depend on math, and so that was important. We were teaching something called orientation in the 7th or 8th grade, and we got that moved into a second period of language arts to strengthen that. They'd never had an English curriculum for secondary schools that had really been worked on, so we prevailed upon the then county superintendent of schools to pay for Napa teachers for a release time 1.5 years to learn and develop an English curriculum for Napa schools. Let's see. So it lasted a long time. Dr. Mack was the superintendent, and he was a wonderful guy with a great sense of humor. And at one point, when we had been doing this and bugging him for about 3 years, he sent us all a letter of congratulations, hoping that we would say, fine, we're through, we'll leave. And Julian Weidler, who was the chair of the committee, we all talked about it, and he said, I'm just going to let Mac know that we're not going anywhere until these changes are made instead of just suggested. So we didn't resign. We just kept studying. We did an interesting study of how kids who had gone from Napa High to a 4-year school did compared with kids who'd gone to Napa High to the junior college and on to 4-year schools. And what we found was that the junior college kids did better in their junior and senior year than their classmates who had gone to Berkeley in the first year. That is, they were coming in more able to perform in junior and senior year university level than the kids who'd gone directly to Berkeley or directly to Chico or directly to Sac State.
It sounds like a very important role for you.
Well, it was fun because my kids were in school. You know, I had one in school, another one just about ready. Well, yeah, she was. She was 4 by then.
So you learned a lot about...
Learned a lot.
And you must have learned a lot from the people who were on the committee.
Yeah, they were wonderful people. It was an incredible group of people.
Now, you were all volunteers.
Yes, but selected by members of the school board.
And when did you first start getting interested in the issues of growth? I know we had talked before, and you told me a lot about what was going on in Napa County.
Well,
I found that interesting.
Yeah, what was going on in Napa County in those early years, and I would categorize those for my awareness would be about the 1960. I don't think those first 5 years I thought very much about it. But by the early 1960s, I realized that the city council had adopted or was on the brink of, I don't remember the timing here, but anyway, they were adopting a general plan that was responding to an ABAG study that said they could really succeed. And so they adopted a general plan that showed that the population by 1975 or 78 somewhere ought to be 120,000 people. And the city of Napa was about, maybe by then it had 15,000 people. But in those days, they were looking at models on the peninsula that, these communities were just exploding, and they were successful, and they had industry coming in, and prunes just didn't cut it. They were just, but anyway, so they were very pro-growth oriented, and I realized that there was something wrong with that picture. And I cannot remember. I do remember that when Silverado turned from a ranch to a country club, and then turned from a country club into the planned community that we now know, that I thought that planned community would cause trouble in the long run because it was outside of the city, and there was another subdivision very near there that was also on a water district. And I realized that we were looking and experiencing urban sprawl, even as young as we were, even as tiny as we were, that the pressures were all on us. And I think I got into local politics because Warren knew a couple of councilmen, and I met them. And then we had a woman mayor, Jerry Hemmerling, quite advanced
How do you
in that
spell
regard.
her name?
Hemmerling. And she was in AAW, and that's where I'd met her. And several other women who were interested in local stuff. And so I was kind of meeting that group through AAW, this one way or another, And I remember going to I decided I would go to a supervisor's candidates night. Now, I don't know when this was, 62, 58, somewhere. And here were these there were about 7 men up there. There were 2 seats being contested, I think. And they were in a school, and I couldn't quite figure out what they thought the big problems with Napa County were. I was trying to figure out what did they want to cure, and it didn't seem to me like they wanted to cure anything, but and I was struck by their, and this seems really, really nosy or really snooty, but I was struck by their rural character. The city council had at least a kind of patina of, I'm from town, And I remember one man who was running, and he said, Napa County's main problems is always roads. And I thought, this is a different group than I'm used to. But they were well-meaning, and they were not, I don't think we've ever had an elected crook, so to speak. It wasn't that at all. But they didn't understand really, they didn't understand how near we were to urban pressures. They were really nice men and really wonderful men, but they did not understand what was going on around them in the Bay Area as a whole. They just didn't have a vision of that at all. And I don't really remember. I remember thinking that it wasn't too good an idea to have a county-supported development council if we didn't know what we wanted. That it looked like a wild chamber that would just go out, and if you were willing to bring some jobs to Napa, you were welcome. And they'd do whatever they could. They didn't have a focus on what kind of jobs they thought were good. And I remember that there was a period along in there, again, I'm going to guess the 60s, where Napa made an attempt, however feeble, to land the automobile plant that is now NUMMI. They decided they were perfect for that.
Now, how do you spell NUMMI?
NUMMI. It's the combination GM Toyota plant that's in well, it's not in San Jose. I guess it's in Fremont now, but it wasn't Fremont then. And it came in, it was a GM plant, and then later on became what it is today. And I realized that I did not think that was going to work. That I thought that the people had underestimated what a plant of that magnitude would do to their community. the
No.
numbers.
That plant today is,
That plant is still in operation, complaining because has had to go back. It's taking at least 2 weeks vacation this month and maybe more paid time. It makes both Toyotas. It makes mostly Toyotas. Has one GM truck, I forget. But anyway, it's been in business for all these times.
so you were concerned.
I was very concerned when the local chamber said, oh, that's the thing we wanted, and they were all looking for it. And I kept thinking, gee, I don't know that you do. You know, I don't think you realize what you're asking. By that time, we understood what was happening in San Jose. As the 60s wore on, the first big outfit to come into that part of the world was Food Machinery Corporation, which basically was building tanks and all that kind of stuff, and industrial machinery and so forth. And that was the first. And then they were followed very closely by IBM and Lockheed, and I don't remember them all, but by that time you were just looking at the peninsula just getting paved, you know, sort of the end of the delicious apricot. It's just gone. The quality of apricot that they could grow in and around Santa Clara, you cannot buy. It doesn't exist anymore. And so we were all, people here were aware of that. But I don't think they understood, I don't think the board understood, I think a lot of people understood what that meant. So I wasn't agreeing with most of the people who had goals for Napa. And one night, I was on this, I worked for a guy who became mayor, you know, helped him, and then I got put on the planning commission.
Now, this is after
It was
Mayor
1968. Oh, yes, this was a guy by the name of Ralph Bolin, B-O-L-I-N, who was a minister. Now, I think that was in 1967 or 68. At the very same time as that happened, in 1960, would have been 1966 and 7, there were people getting very concerned about the loss of agricultural lands. Now, at that point, ABAG was coloring Napa County all green. I mean, you literally could go down and look at the ABAG maps, and Napa was just one big green swath for open space and green. And
ABAG.
Was the Association of Bay Area Governments. It still exists. It colors us any old color that's in the crayon box at the time they have to finish their study, in my view, right now. You know, if red for commercial is in their box first, that's what they color. It's not made much sense in late years. And so I realized, though, that this group that was concerned about the loss of agricultural lands were probably right. And that it meant a shift of our basic industry. Here was people talking about an automobile plant, and people talking about this and that, and they were not talking about agriculture as any sort of lasting future. They did not, you know, even though there were people talking about what had happened in San Jose and what had happened in all this. So the board, and I do not know which board member or which group of them, but somebody on the board responded to a suggestion by the agricultural extension head here.
And this is the Board of Supervisors.
Board of Supervisors. They responded to his suggestion that he could get, his name was Jack Fiske, F-I-S-K-E, and he found that he could get money from UC Davis and could get help from the Ag Department of UC Davis to do some work in a new method they had just perfected to find out where the costs were, where the profits were, who paid and who benefited if you changed a land use from one thing to the next. And it was not terribly sophisticated, but it was the first of those tools that Davis had. And he persuaded the county board to let him apply and get these guys over here and get them working. So they agreed. They said, sure, we'd like to know. Well, when Davis took about a year and a half, there were two men. I think one was named Tim Goodman, but oh my, that's a long time ago.
These were two economists?
Two agricultural economists from UC Davis, and they had tried this tool in some small piece of Sonoma County, and they were tickled to death to have Napa County to work on. And when they got through with what was an input-output mix, meaning if you had this, you could decide who would make money, who would be benefited and who would be hurt, and how long, and who, and that sort of thing. And they came up with the fact that if Napa developed the way the rest of the Bay Area was starting to develop, that it would lose money in the public sector and might even lose money on an average wage in the overall wage. Now, they were predicting this because they were replacing ag lands with homes primarily and the necessary commercial support systems. They did not do an analysis of anything like the NUMMI plant. They just, if you replace this with that. So it became clear to the board then that to replace agriculture with houses was a loser, that they would not benefit. Even though everybody thought growth was your friend, this proved that that was not true in Napa County, that we would lose so much by allowing those ag lands to pass into subdivisions, that the government itself would be poorer and that the average wage in the community might even go down, which was a real surprise. I mean, and so they picked up on that, and they decided they would try to preserve the best of the agriculture, based on the fact that it was producing agriculture and that it was good soils, and that this input-output said, don't let that get covered up with houses.
Because then part of the argument was that once you create these developments, now you have to provide schools and roads
Exactly.
and
Yeah,
infrastructure,
right.
infrastructural improvements.
Right. And there were segments of the population that would benefit from that, i.e., certainly if you were in the construction business, that was a beneficial direction to go. But it was not beneficial for the average person. And remember that at that time, our major employers were the state hospital with a census. I can't remember what the census was in the 60s. In the 50s, it was the largest state mental hospital this side of the Mississippi. And it still was the largest mental hospital this side of the Mississippi entering the 60s. So I have no idea, because you see the new medicines came out right about then and emptied the state hospitals. So I don't remember those census numbers. Also, we had Mare Island. Also, we were beginning to have Travis. The Air Force Base had developed during the war. Hamilton Field had some of our people, and Hamilton Field was not being used very much anymore. It had been Army.
And that was in Marin.
That was
County.
in Marin. And Travis was in Solano. And then we had the Veterans Home. So we had a large, stable, middle-class income base. And so what they saw was that as you grow, you get not only wealthy people but poor people. You get not only businesses that pay well but businesses that pay poorly. And so that was that it showed where San Jose would be the results they predicted. So the board they were really hooked. They figured they liked agriculture and they were going to hang on to it. So they drew this agricultural preserve. I'm going to use the figure 28,000 acres, but it was the floor of the valley. the best, richest lands we had.
And this was after, this is much later than the passage of the Williamson Act, which happened in 65.
Yeah, but it
Or a
wouldn't be
little bit
much.
later, not much.
It wouldn't be much. See, everybody was sort of interested in ag lands. They'd seen what happened both in LA and here, and they were saying, how can we keep people in the farming business? So the Williamson Act was there as a tool, but nobody was really pushing it. But they were interested in saving the floor of the valley, and some of it was genuine interest in agriculture, very genuine. And some of it just, my God, we can't let that city of Napa pave paradise. There was a political element that was absolutely right in the middle of this.
What members of the board do you most remember being
I remember
influenced?
Henry Wigger being the most vocal and probably the most effective in letting the community know how good an idea this was. Julius Kyoka was in a terrible spot. I think I mentioned to you when we talked last that Julius was an insurance man, mostly in property, and had some interest in the agricultural interests, and he was from St. Helena. And he had a real hard time. He believed it, but he had a really hard time because his constituency was very conservative, and lots of ag people did not want anybody telling them what they could do with their land. I mean, you cannot say, oh, the farmers were all for it. That's not really accurate. So he had the worst time.
Who were some of the other members now?
Oh my, let's see. There was Jack Ferguson. Jack was an attorney. He was young. He could see that was happening, and that he didn't want to lose the ag as an economic interest. He felt it was a vital economic thing to protect. And I think he'd grown up here. I think he sort of liked having the rural things around. Let's see, was Andy
Now,
Fajani on that? No.
Dewey Anderson,
Dewey was,
he on the board at this point?
yeah, I guess he was. I remember being for it. I remember that they had by this time hired Al Haberger, as they had finally hired a county administrator. I'm guessing they hired him in the 60s, somewhere mid to late. I don't remember. That would be interesting to know. But Al was all for it. He had come from El Centro, California, and he really had a sensitivity to not losing that. And his huge contribution was not only to, sort of guide the process and do all the things of being sure there were a lot of public hearings and public meetings and trotting this thing around, but Al was very wise in that what he convinced the members of the board that they all 5 had to stand or fall together. And there was one who couldn't vote because he had a conflict of interest.
That was Pete Clark.
Right.
Now, the other members of the board at this time there were Henry Wigger,
Right.
Jack L. Ferguson,
Mm-hmm.
Julius Kyoka, Dewey Anderson,
Uh-huh.
and then Pete Clark.
Right. And Pete couldn't vote.
He couldn't vote because
He was so deeply in agriculture that I think he had just built-in conflicts of interest. Where Dewey was an auto service, Henry was a mortician, Jack was a lawyer, and Julius I've talked about. He was
And Pete Clark,
Pete Clark, oh gosh. I never really knew what Pete Clark did. He was my supervisor, and every 4th year we would get new paving on all the potholes. He was the supervisor here in Alta Heights because there was no one man, one vote, so they didn't want anybody from the city being on the board. So they divvied up the city of Napa. So you had everybody nobody lived in the city of Napa. You were all, now let's see, who had
In
lived
other
in the
words, you
city?
could represent a district in which you did not live.
No, you had to live in your district, but
Yeah.
the district came out of the city of Napa like stars, like pieces of a pie. Napa had, and still do. Napa's still represented by five,
Different districts?
5 different supervisors. All 5 supervisors have some in the
Some.
city of Napa. Even the supervisor for Calistoga. Well, they don't want that city of Napa getting ahead of them, you know. Anyway, so they were really fascinated with this idea, and I think they were convinced that they were doing something really wonderful. I think they were aware that this wasn't being done anywhere in an area that was being threatened by urbanization. And I think they were very proud of the fact that they'd gone through this, and there were lots and lots of people at those public hearings. Now, the pro-ag hearings,
Oh,
the commission ever really holding public meetings, there were many meetings held to various citizens groups to describe what the Davis study talked about.
oh, so
See,
even
so
before.
there were meetings that were held, and they were not big public meetings. AAUW might have one of them in. Somebody else might have them. Various and sundry people prior to the Planning Commission had seen this idea, had seen this explained to them, not thoroughly, but hey, this is new stuff here. We'd like you to look at it. So they were building a base of people who understood
Now,
what.
were these meetings that would be also held in different geographic areas of the county?
I don't remember if there were very many of those or not. I was not aware at all of what they were doing outside much of from, say, the city of Napa south. I'm not at all aware. I know they did. But remember that most of those early meetings were civic group connected, or they were not public. They were not being held by a public agency.
So they would, what other?
They were informal. You might have them in front of the chamber. You might have them in front of Rotary. You might have them in front of, a farm group. And they were just to explain what this was all about.
So word was kind of.
They were selling the concept long before, the idea of putting it into a zoning ordinance.
Now, who would give these talks? It would be members of the Board of Supervisors?
Once in a while, but a lot of them were on the ag staff, were the county ag staff. They might get one of the guys down from Davis to make a presentation, explain what it was.
Were there articles in the newspapers?
I would suspect there were. Again, I can't speak for the St. Helena Star. My impression is that Star, the editor, Star, Starr, Star Baldwin, I think, was very much in favor of the ag preserve.
His first name was Starr?
Mm-hmm. The St. Helena
Starr.
Star was owned by Starr.
Starr Baldwin.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. I know the Star is correct. And my impression is that he favored it. And so he did not really go to war in terms of using his paper. And I think probably there were enough businessmen, enough people. I don't remember. Somebody would have to show me what the Register was doing or saying in those days. I don't remember.
Was Lowell Eddington very active at this point? I know.
Somebody else is going to have to fill in how Lowell viewed that ag preserve. His wife, I know, was in favor of it. Astrid.
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 And
Now,
he
she
had
worked for the Register. And he had been on the Board of Supervisors. He had been. And, let me see, when did he do all this? And he was then on the Golden Gate Bridge District Board during the 60s.
Was he a influential?
I think he was. I think he was influential. I know that both of them were in their own right. Lowell probably more up valley than down. And again, you know, he was a generation ahead of me, pretty close. And I knew her a little bit because of the register connection, and she would be around where I was, where Lowell was not.
Now at what point did he begin the Upper Napa Valley Associates?
Well, actually, now it's interesting that Lowell's name is connected with that, because yes, it should be, but the Upper Napa Valley Associates did not come along until after the fight over the Ag Preserve. In other words, at the time when suddenly the lobbying became the most intense. Now that was after the Planning Commission had okayed it. Now remember, you've met Don McFarland. So those hearings and the preface to those hearings was just almost bloody. And I mean, there were really, really people who you knew who were adamant that that would never happen, and there were others who were adamant that it absolutely had to. I mean, it was not it was not government by silence, and it was completely visible.
Well, we'll come to that in a minute. But I just want to...
See, I think UNVA was formed. See, I look at the spirit of UNVA as being present toward the people who founded UNVA were present by the end of the lobbying period, but that was Jack Davies. It was Lowell. It was...
But that's later on.
It's sort of... I think it was forming itself during the hearings before the board and during all that time.
Well, let's
I don't know what its founding date is.
Let's backtrack just a
Okay.
little. I wanted to ask you a little bit about Dorothy Erskine.
Oh, yeah.
And William Bronson, and also the first forum that I've been able to find information on, sort of more formal forum, that was sponsored by the UC Davis
Right.
Agricultural Extension and California Tomorrow.
Yes.
Which was a group that I think
William
Bronson launched.
Yes. Okay. Right.
So that forum now took place in May of 1966, and I wondered if
That's
you
one of... Yes. Yes, I went to that one. But I wouldn't say I knew very many of the actors at that time, other than the ag group. Okay, I think that's when I got acquainted with a lot of these people, but they were not people that I was really all that acquainted with. I met Dorothy Erskine. I didn't meet... When did I meet Dorothy? I met Dorothy, I guess, in the later 60s. It was later. It was a little bit later than that. And then it was Dorothy who said, oh, we have to do all these wonderful things and preserve all this, and you can do it. You can do it. Dorothy always felt that anybody she could inspire could just take it and do it. And you, half the time you fell for it and thought maybe you might be able to. But she was really unbelievable. And so Dorothy, she had a house, a weekend house up above Calistoga. She lived in San Francisco. And when I met Dorothy, I knew about Dorothy because she was one of 5 women who had worked every connection they had to plant the seeds of BCDC, the Bay Protection. Okay. And there were 5 women. Mrs. Clark Kerr was one of them. I've since met another one. About 10 years ago, I met another one. But
was that Saving the San Francisco
Save the Bay. Save the Bay. And Dorothy also founded and added Greenbelt Alliance. Now, Greenbelt Alliance, I have a hunch, is really kind of grew out of both of those little nascent organizations. And which came first? I know Greenbelt came after California Tomorrow, but how much of California Tomorrow it used, I don't know. You know, it's kind of like we all are second cousins twice removed, and once you get something like that going, and you see some of the same names. Ira Michael Hyman from Cal was a lawyer, later dean.
How do you spell his name?
Heymann, Ira Michael Hyman. And Dorothy had him in her grasp. And so he would just put on all kinds of interesting things and turn the university's ability over for these good causes. And I think he later served as chancellor. I knew him before then, so I don't really know. But
He would allow the university to be used for conferences?
oh, yes, and then you could say, who is it who knows about this? And he would be happy to tell you that so-and-so knew about that. Today, for example, the same sort of inner network has built in and around energy, global warming, and certain environmental things. You can call Berkeley, and you can say, if you know the right person, and say, I need somebody to come and talk about this. For example, Dan, what's his name? Goldman? Anyway, there's a guy down there who is a professor who did the research that proved that this was 5 years ago, that had the United States, had every state in the United States done what California was doing at that moment, that we would not be importing a single gallon of foreign oil. Now, that was 5 years ago. Dan. Anyway, but see, those kinds of resources are available for you. And so he would make those kinds of resources available to you if you wanted to put together, what about a big freeway? If you wanted to put together something, how does transportation hook into this? If you wanted to discuss these impacts or what they were learning or what the front end of all of this was, you had Davis and you had UC. So
it was a very good environment.
Mm-hmm. And Dorothy was in touch with them all.
Now, do you remember when you went to this forum in May of 1966, sponsored by the UC Ag Extension and California Tomorrow? Didn't William Bronson speak?
Yes, he was there, but that I was new at this game. That was sort of interesting to me. You know, he was another name. It was like, oh yeah, how about that?
Now,
I didn't really, I was impressed with California Tomorrow, and here was the leader, but not terribly,
He proposed at this meeting, I think, the possibility of nationalizing the
Yes.
Napa vineyards.
The National Vineyards had a constituency here for quite a while. The idea of nationalizing the vineyards and running them as a national monument kind of thing. The problem with that, as it developed, is that it's a charming concept, but the funding of services and the on-site management is very difficult when you are under the national government, which thinks that you're so far across the Hudson River that they're never going to find you. I mean, and in those days, California was a growing, big place. I can remember my dad getting offered this thing in the 60s, early 60s, that, was it then? Yeah, close to then. That they told him that he could move to San Francisco and instead of Oakland, and because they were going to make two areas. And what did he want? And he told them that he said, that's very nice of you to ask. So he got everything from the California border down through all Monterey, all of the acceptable stuff, all the way down almost to Bakersfield, plus the East Bay, some of the East Bay, the southern part of the East Bay, and Stockton. And, I mean, he had the agricultural heart of California as in this urban area, and and they didn't know a thing about it in New York. When he would say, I'd like to have Humboldt County, okay. I really need to have Santa Cruz County, okay. I mean, they were playing with little toy pieces of a puzzle.
Like Monopoly or something.
Oh, yeah, and so it was not a simple thing to talk about a national vineyard. I was never captured by it, although I think a lot of people in Napa were. But I didn't see how that, and in a way, I think right today they've proved us right, which is that national anythings have, if they're not making money, they're not doing real well.
And do you remember whether Dorothy Erskine had a position on that?
I don't remember. She may have. She may have.
Was she was so good at putting people together. Was
Yeah.
she kind of sparkly as
Oh,
a
yeah.
personality?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And by the time I knew Dorothy, but got to know her better, she already had gray hair, but she walked more briskly than most people did at 20. And she just was full of ideas and enthusiasm. And she just charmed the socks off most people.
Now, John Tudor told me that she was at the same time quite modest.
Oh, yes, as far as her own contribution to it, you could hardly ever get her to admit it. You really couldn't. And I remember, Don McFarland would remember this too, that after I met Dorothy, and I just found her everywhere, you know, she was dragging me to all these meetings, but in addition to that, I was having a great time. And she was here one time, and she needed to go to Sacramento to the Parks Department for something, she said, and she didn't have a ride except that her son could bring her to Napa. Well, I offered to take her, and she said, no, I don't want to do that. And I said, well, my friend Don McFarland is going to talk to the people at the parks because he's going to talk to them about a little place that they're developing called Berryessa. And he wants to talk to them about that. So Don's story is that this gentleman dropped off this very old woman at his doorstep of his office, and she introduced herself, and he said he was looking forward to taking her. So they drove to Sacramento and parked, and they went into the reception office of the state parks office, and the secretary said, hello, Dorothy, what can we do for you today? Bill will just be love to see you. Wait a minute, I'm sure he's in his office. She calls in Bill Mott, the head of state, and she calls in all these other people. And poor Don, who's there with this one little question, called me up and said, you should have told me she knew all these people. I said, I didn't know. I said, I knew she knew them. Didn't you know who she was? No, he said, I never guessed.
She was very well connected.
Out of her hard work. Nothing but hard work. You know.
Very.
Yeah. Yeah, she was, yeah, we owe her. California owes her a lot. Northern California especially. Yeah,
So we're saying that the two agricultural economists at Davis who were responsible for this study that looked at land use changes were Goodman.
Tim Goodman, I think,
Tim
is on that
Goodman.
document.
And perhaps the other one was J.H. Snyder,
Right.
an agricultural economist at UC Davis.
Right.
So that's very interesting. And so that must have been like an economic model, that's sort of an early modeling system to.
Yeah, it was an early input-output matrix modeling form that the only other time I ever saw it used was when they wanted to know in the city of Santa Rosa, they wanted to know something about what do they call it, the speed of money circulating, the velocity, which is a factor in money supply. Velocity is a really important factor. And so they wanted to know which of the monies had the most velocity in a local economy, and they found out it was welfare dollars. That welfare dollars never stay in anybody's pocket more than 2 or 3 days, no matter who they're dealing with, because they're dealing with grocers who are on a short string, they're dealing with retail people who need that dollar, they're dealing with all these various people who all need the dollar quickly. And so a welfare dollar will circulate through the economy of Santa Rosa 8 times before another kind of dollar, say your house payment.
Interesting.
So it's like $8, see?
Because it keeps
That's why.
changing hands.
That's right.
Very interesting. So you attended this forum.
I did. I don't remember a whole lot about it. I just remember thinking, that's just very interesting. And then there were a lot, I remember being very interested.
And now,
I don't know where I went from there.
when I talked to John Tudor, he told me that Georgia Beatty was also very active at
He
this
was.
point.
Georgia Beatty, because he was the assessor, had looked at the Williamson bill and realized that it was a good tool, but that it was very, very limited. George saw the limitations of the Williamson Act right away. He wanted it to work. He was not opposed to it, as many assessors were, because it made their jobs harder. Because they had to be prepared to assess your piece of property of agriculture. They had to be prepared to assess it one of 2 ways and justify those and then figure out which one was best for you.
And the 2 ways would have been market value for development purposes.
Market value and income.
And its agricultural value.
Right. So, but he was all for it. George was a good, he was a lot, I think of George as being the kind of guy that wanted to make it work. And he had enough imagination to know that that was important. George, yeah, well, I have a big voice. Forgot all about putting the coffee pot in front of it. Yes, George had enough imagination to realize what this would mean. And he understood it was more work. But he was really in favor of it. He really liked the idea of preserving agriculture.
And was he a forceful speaker? Was he persuasive?
He wasn't a salesman. George was very matter of fact. He was very warm. He had a nice, well, when you meet him, you'll know.
I've talked to him on the phone, and he seems just very straightforward.
He is.
And
He is.
what you hear is what it is.
That's it. Right. Yeah.
Now, was Al Haberger?
Now, Al Haberger came to Napa, and as I've said to you, I don't remember which year, but I do remember that Henry was really high on him. I think Dewey was one of the people who really felt they needed a county administrator. And otherwise, I can't really recall who. I was not in on that discussion in the board as to what to do, but I know that they really. In Al's case, I think they got the idea of the position and then went looking for somebody and talked to various statewide board members.
Because this was a new position.
Mm-hmm.
There had not previously
Never.
been a county administrator.
No, nor had there been much of a county planning director either. I don't remember when we changed over from Clyde Cassidy, but
Who is Clyde Cassidy?
he was the quote-unquote planning manager in Napa for years and years and years. He was from, Public Works. He was an engineer.
And how do you spell his name?
Cassidy. His widow's still living, I think. Alberta's still alive, but maybe not.
So
Anyway, so
Al Haberger's role as county administrator was to what?
he was then like a manager that the board hires. He works at the whim of the board. He does what the board outlines him to do. And the first one gets to sort of define the limits and the potential of the job. Because they have an idea of, I want somebody to keep so-and-so and run that department a little better than that department head is and kind of train these people. Our auditor was functioning as the financial manager. But they're just, we didn't have a personnel department till Al came, I don't think.
Now, did he have line authority over county staff?
Mm-hmm.
He
Yes.
did.
Yes, he did. He did not have, he had the power given to him by the board at any given time, which is what I mean by describing the job, by making the job the way he wanted to work it out with. He had, if there was any sort of power vacuum, and he was very good at it, and any other executive officer in a county in California expands as soon as they can and expands wherever they can. And the one department they don't like to expand to is welfare, because they don't understand it. And who does? And it's very complex, and it's very state regulated in a lot of ways. So if they have a good welfare director, they're happy, because they can.
They don't have to worry about it.
They try not to.
But, so Al Haberger had a very influential.
He had an absolutely central role in this thing being passed into that ordinance the way, at the time it was, and with the 4 votes.
Did he help to organize these meetings that were now going to be held before the Napa County Planning Commission to discuss?
I think he helped organize them. We used to kid, I don't remember either when Jim Hickey came, but Hickey was the last. There was.
He came after.
Yes, oh yes, and it was a couple of years. It wasn't, it was.
I think he came in 1970.
Yeah, right. And there was an attorney, a county attorney, named Steve Hackett. And Steve, I don't think, was the county attorney who drew up the Ag Preserve at all. But he became one of its earliest defenders and implementers. That is, he had pieces of words, he had words on a page, and how you made that work. Steve was instrumental, as well as Al, and later Jim Hickey, in making it work.
Now, Mervyn
Learnhardt was the attorney from the county council's office who had been assigned that area.
So he worked for Steve?
He worked for the county council, and I don't think Steve was the county council at that time, but Merv can tell you.
Okay. Yes, I have the name of the county council.
It wasn't Steve
No.
at that time.
It was someone else.
And I know one of his kids went in the sheriff's department, became the acting coroner, and is already retired.
So we're talking about
Dan York. Yeah.
He was the county council.
Yeah.
And Merv
Was-
Learnhardt was his deputy.
Yes, right.
He was just a young kid.
Oh, he was really young.
fresh out of law school.
I know it.
So the two of them were responsible for crafting the language that would eventually become Ordinance 274.
I think so.
The creation
I
of the
think
Ag
so.
Reserve.
Now, I wasn't on the inside of government at this time, so when you ask me that, I have to say they held positions that would probably mean they were responsible. But there may have been somebody, it might have been Al, might have been somebody from the Planning Commission that decided, look, it should read this way. I don't know.
Did you go to the meetings that were held
Did.
before the Planning Commission?
Yeah, I went to one of the Planning Commission hearings, I think. I think I just went to one.
Now, so I'll throw out some names and see if there's anything you remember about them. Vern Cotter was planning director.
Yes, he's what happened to Clyde Cassidy. Vern Cotter took over, yes, right.
And he was very pro.
I think, I don't think Vern particularly led or followed. I think what he did was implement. That is, if Al and the county council and everybody was going to do this, he would be in on the writing, he would be in on all the meetings arrangements, but I don't remember him as being a person who felt he should push either way.
What about
But I might be wrong.
Eric Borgward?
Yeah, I remember him, but I don't know what he did.
He was assistant planning director, so he must have been under Vern. Jack Fisk apparently participated in these
Yes.
hearings. He was then state liaison to the county
For agriculture. Right.
So he must have presented.
I'm sure he presented along with these other two ag guys. Jack was the one who I know got many of the little local meetings going that I told you about.
Earlier.
Yeah, right.
Yes. And Aldo Delfino.
Al Delfino, Delfino. Aldo Delfino. Al was ag commissioner, I believe, for the county, and he and his family had been around quite a while, and he would have defended agriculture completely. Whether or not Al felt it was somewhat of an intrusion on farmers' rights is something I don't know. So, a lot of the people connected with the ag did feel that intrusion. You know, because Napa County was zoned 1 house, 1 acre,
Yes, and
the whole county.
correct. And weren't you involved with, in fact, an organization called 1 House, 1 Acre, or not?
Mm-mm.
All right. But at this, had the Napans opposing Wasteland been
Okay, now Napans Opposing Wastelands, Inc. Let's see.
So because
Oh,
we're
God.
now in the lead up to the
Napans Opposing Wastelands, Inc. did not exist in the Ag Preserve years. Napans Opposing Wastelands, Inc. came about later. It was an ad hoc.
All right. Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah, it was an ad hoc.
We'll get to that.
Now, Napans Opposing, and I think now Napans Opposing Wastelands, Inc., we formed it that way because there was no now. So you know how it was a while ago? Somebody came and said, there's a national organization with your name.
So once the hearings took place before the Planning Commission, then the Planning Commission got on board, and they held their own hearings through the community.
Public hearings.
Public hearings.
Yes, and they did, I know, go up and down the county.
So they went up and down. So they'd go to Calistoga or Salina or...
You'd have to look, but I know that they went. I don't believe they went to American Canyon because it was just a little